So I'm absolutely delighted to welcome virtually Heath Lilley of Queen's University Belfast, who's going to talk about fields of empire. And this is another one of those lovely crossover moments that we talked about this morning, where we've got someone from an external discipline, in a way, having a lot to say to us and being brave, as we decided we would be very early this morning. So Keith, over to you.
Thanks very much. That was Karen. Yeah,
that was Karen. Yeah.
So great. So thanks everybody for being there this afternoon and tuning in. And I'm going to say a few words for the next sort of 25 minutes or so on the topic of fields of empire. I'm going to also show my PowerPoint. I'm hoping the tech works for everybody. So I'll start sharing my screen. And then after the presentation, which is quite a visual thing, really, then we can have some discussion, I hope. So anyway, let me see if I can organize I should be used to this now. There we go. So this should now be, I hope, visible.
Yeah, perfect.
Excellent. Right. Yeah, so the title of I hope this fits quite well with some of the discussion that you're having over these next few days. The empire speaks back in a post-colonial dialect for the summer school. So with that in mind, I thought some of the work I've been doing recently around mapping in India and Ireland, which is where I am at the moment, which is why I'm not with you, might be of interest because it fits within a broader set of conceptual debates in the history of cartography around post-colonialism and the idea of decolonizing the map, which I'm going to say a few words about in a moment. So the work I'm going to be talking about today is pretty much what I'm doing at the moment. So some project content here as well, some recent research that I've been doing. The image on the slide here is quite a good starting point for thinking about fields of empire. I think in the history of cartography, in historical geography, in the humanities more broadly, actually, there's been perhaps a tendency in thinking about mapping empires using the map principally. The visual endpoint of map making is the map. What I'm interested in is looking behind the map to the landscape, to the field, hence the title, and making connections between maps and landscapes. And that's really what I want to be looking at in today's presentation over the next sort of 30 minutes, 25, 30 minutes. Places and spaces perhaps requires a little bit of unpacking as well, because as you all well know, as linguists and as experts in language, they are not synonyms. Places and spaces are not synonyms. So I like to use the work of a fellow geographer. I'm a geographer by background, as my discipline. A geographer called Ifu Tuan, who wrote many books over many years, one of which was called Topophilia. And Ifu Tuan draws a distinction between space and place, which I think is useful for us just to have in our minds. And this image actually speaks to that distinction, I think, as well. So space, he describes space is movement. And he says place is pause. And I quite like that. I like the way in which he suggests that spaces are constructed through movement, through mobilities, through circulation, whether through bodies, through ideas. You know, spaces is something which are fluid, always being made, performed. And then he uses the word pause for place. It's a sense of dwelling, that we are in situ, in one location, in a particular locale. And this image, I think, speaks to that. You know, the image of the landscape, which you can see there, which I'm going to talk about in a bit more detail later on, from India, from where I did my field work in West Bengal, is about a particular place. But the map behind there, which you can see showing the Great Trigonometrical Survey of India, in a sense speaks to spaces, because these are connections forged between particular locations by movement, mobile bodies, and objects. So I think Ifrituan's distinction between place and space, between space and place, space being movement and place being pause, about pause, I think is useful. And we might want to talk about that a little bit later on. And the survey part of the title there relates to the work of surveyors in the making of maps. So we may be looking, we may be often actually quite, we sort of tend to fetishize the visual, the image in a map, and people put them on their walls and so on. But what lies behind the map in terms of the map making process is often survey, field survey. And hence the title Fields of Empire, because what I want to do is take us on a journey in a sense away from the map and back into the landscape and the field from which those maps were made in India and in Ireland as well in the early part of the 19th century. So that's really where I'm coming from here. Now, I said at the start there is this kind of conceptual turn, post-colonial turn in history of cartography. And this volume by Akerman, Decolonizing the Map, has in it some, fantastic work. And one particular quotation there resonates with me. I'm working at the moment with colleagues on the Ordnance Survey in Ireland. And some of you may well know actually that we've just only recently heard that in Britain at least anyway, or perhaps even just in England, translations is no longer going to be featuring as part of the English curriculum, which is obviously a bit of a shame. But those of you who know Brian Friel's play translations, what's interesting for me here is that in the chapter by Raymond Craib here on cartography and decolonisation in this volume, instead of drawing upon the work of, say, John Andrews, and who has done over the years, many years, actually a lot of detailed work on the history of the Ordnance Survey, which is a state mapping organisation on the island of Ireland. Interestingly, Craig turns instead to Friel's play translations in talking about place names and naming and how maps are important in constructing a sense of identity through the places that are named, the languages which are used, the names which are left off the map, the ways in which names are particularly spelled out, and so on. So those of you who know translations will know the play is really all about that process. And so what Craig refers to here actually is a quotation from Friel's play about English couldn't really express us. That's obviously an Irish perspective in the naming of landscapes and toponyms and so on these maps. What I want to try and do here is just begin to open up some of this discussion around decolonising the map. The focus tends to be much on the map rather than the fields. And I want to take us away from the map image and more to the fields. Why this is important here in the context of Craib's little quotation is it begins to show that there are layers upon layers upon layers when we begin to talk about maps and landscapes. So Andrews himself was quite critical of Brian Friel's translations and wrote an article, I'm holding it here, in the Irish Review, which came out in the 1980s, I think this was. And in it, one of the things that Andrews mentions in particular relates to this passage that Craib has identified here and offers a criticism. Nor was it necessary to do much anglicising, says Andrews. In most parts of Ireland, almost all the written versions available to the Ordnance Survey officers were already anglicised, from all of which it should now be clear that very few of the names on the Ordnance map, like the one you see here, were new in the 1830s, this is. That it is dangerously ambiguous to describe what the Ordnance Survey did as naming. So, this is quite a controversial topic. It's quite a complicated topic. It's interesting that Craig maybe uses, instead of Andrews, Friel in making the point. But it's something I want to try and open up by going back to the field. Those people that Friel himself was interested in, irrespective actually of the criticisms of John Andrews. What Friel describes is that field activity, the surveyors themselves, in the landscape. So actually thinking about what the surveyors for the Ordnance Survey on the island of Ireland in the 1820s, 1830s were actually doing in the fields. So looking behind the map, so to speak. So there is a quite an interesting post-colonial and critical discourse around this. Julian Doherty's book, The Irish Ordnance Survey, begins to open up some of that conceptually for us. And I'm going to draw upon two particular projects to do this. One builds exactly what we've just been looking at, actually, on the Ordnance Survey on the island of Ireland, and a community heritage project in the north of Ireland around Benevena, which is on Lough Foyle, which is what you're seeing here in that image there, looking across to the Inishowen Peninsula. For those of you who don't know that part of the world, Benevena is the rocky headland on the left-hand side. So I want to draw upon that project in this and look at the Lough Foyle baseline. We'll say a bit more about that in due course. And another project which was funded by the British Academy a few years ago, 2017, 2018, called Surveying Empires, and was a collaboration with the University of Calcutta and involved field work in West Bengal as well around Calcutta. So two projects. One community orientated, one more university orientated, but both with a kind of common ground of trying to go back into the field and revisiting the sites of survey, of looking behind the map. You know, these are the kinds of maps, the one you're looking at here, the Imperial Federation map from 1886, which we see so often in publicity, whether it's publicity for conferences, seminars, we see them reproduced on book covers. You know, it's dangerous actually that we have so many of these images circulating without, I think, sometimes the apparatus to begin to actually think about what we're doing here in reprojecting these images of empire. You know, so there's something to be said here, I think, for beginning to unpick some of this, looking at this imagery. And of course, you know, historians of cartography are doing that. And Matthew Edney's book, Mapping an Empire, on the Great Trigonometrical Survey of India and the Survey of India in the 19th century is a fantastic volume about that process, looking specifically at the British in India. But working from map to field, to looking behind the map, to what lies behind it, which is the landscape, the localities from which these maps were made. So what I'm working on at the moment is a bigger project, in a sense, which begins to try and put together different case studies from around the British Empire, different colonial contexts. I call this Fields of Empire. And what I'm going to do in today's talk, very briefly, is just work you through some of the ways in which I'm beginning to explore these fields of empire and looking behind the map. One is around mobilities and the movement of people and objects, thinking about spaces, in other words, about how imperial spaces were constructed through movement. The second is about monuments, this is more about places, about localities, about what went on in the landscape, in particular places through the map making and surveying process. And then the third point there is trying to put the two things together, but more from a contemporary perspective of the 21st century, what this adds up to, what it means in a kind of post-colonial theatre. So linking together these different sites of survey across the British Empire is really something I'm quite interested in at the moment. And what I'm talking about today is just two case studies from Ireland and from India. So critical cartography is quite a big topic, actually. And I think just in essence here, and you can digest this perhaps at a later date, there are lots of quotations here, but in essence, there's a move away from the visual and representational theory to non-representational. Think about performance and practice, about context, which you see in Chris Perkins's quotation there, which means bringing the practice of survey in map making terms into the equation, which is the second quotation there from Matthew Edney's book. And one of the things Edney actually highlights for us is how often in the history of cartography, despite this kind of critical cartography approach, field work is sort of written out of the discussion. You know, it's something which is overlooked, as he says there, by critical map scholars, avoiding the issue of the relationship to field work and the graphic map. Well, I'm a geographer. I like to go back into the field as much as I like to go into an archive or a library. And I think what we need to do in our critical cartographies, in exploring mapping practices, is not just think about the map and the way it works through a set of social relations, how it speaks to us, how it was constructed, the silences on the map and all those sorts of things, but also going back and looking behind the map back into the field and looking at those social relations and cultural encounters which are being constructed through the map making process in the field. Now, how we're going to do that is a thing that I'm beginning to sort of think through myself a little bit in a broader kind of context, thinking about the interrelations between core and periphery, and the kind of models that are often used to describe these relationships in the British Empire and the construction of empire through cultural encounters. So here we have Barry Crosby's book, which I'm sure many of you will know. What I find interesting from those quotations which you see here, which is making a connection between the Ordnance Survey of Ireland, the Ordnance Survey being the state mapping body, British state mapping body, which was mapping Ireland in the 1820s, 1830s. And his idea here, Barry Crosby's idea here, that there was some influence, as he puts it here, on what was going on in India and the Great Trigonometrical Survey, so another great big mapping enterprise for India. And that quotation to me encapsulates a bit of a problem here, a dilemma, and a question really about whether we should see this sort of, as he would seems to describe it here, as an outward flowing from the heart of empire, from Britain and from Ireland to India. What I would like to see is something rather more complex and nuanced, more along the lines of what the sort of work that Alan Lester has been doing at the University of Sussex, of thinking about the cultural encounters and interrelations between different parts of the British Empire, rather than seeing as, you know, something happening at the heart of empire, as it were, and then flowing out to the periphery. There are these interrelations ongoing in the 19th century between big mapping enterprises, large-scale mapping enterprises, including the Ordnance Survey's operations in Great Britain and also in Ireland, and the Survey of India and the Great Trigonometrical Survey of India at about the same time. In these, as you see, this fairly complicated diagram here in the chronology, which comes from Matthew Edney's book, Mapping an Empire, it just serves to show the contemporary nature of those two large-scale imperial mapping operations in Ireland and in India. So what I want to look at in a little bit more detail now. And I'm going to do that firstly by looking at our mobilities theme and these two men. And again, you know, just thinking about this for a moment, this is a very male and very white story on the surface. But if you begin to scratch away at it, it becomes a little bit more complicated. So here's a quotation from Matthew Edney's book, which, you know, points to the importance of a visit. George Everest, superintendent, so he was in charge of this huge survey operation in India called the Great Trigonometrical Survey of India in the 1820s, visiting Ireland, the north of Ireland, actually around Benevena, which you saw earlier on that earlier slide, on the north coast of Ireland, on Lough Foyle there, visiting the Director General or the leader of the Ordnance Survey, Thomas Colby, pictured there on the left-hand side. There's these two great men coming together on this, you know, sort of low-lying part of the Irish coast in Benevena. So this is what Edney's describing there. So the quotation and the thinking about this, you know, we might think about the spaces through which the British Empire has been constructed, through the meeting of minds, through flows of ideas, through the flows of bodies. Everest he was working in India, revisiting, coming back to Great Britain and then over to Ireland to see what Colby was doing, to learn about Colby's beautiful system as it's described here from contemporary sources. So there are these connections, and we can begin to explore those cartographically as well. And it begins to point, I think, as well, to some interesting differences between what was going on in India as well as what was going on in Ireland. So in India, the scale, the magnitude is massively different to the situation that Colby faced in Ireland. You know, the scale, I've got two maps here, both at the same scale, and you can begin to see, you know, in relation to India, you know, what Colby was doing in Ireland was a relatively, you know, small scale operation. It's significant in itself, but not on the scale that Everest was faced in India. So, you know, there are differences, is all I'm trying to say here. And sometimes there's a danger in trying to find commonalities and connections, and we should also recognize differences. As well as people moving, Everest, moving to Ireland and Colby moving backwards and forwards between Britain and Ireland and so on, constructing these imperial spaces. We also have mobilities of objects themselves. So in the case of the measurement of what's called the Lochfoyle baseline, which is an important part of the Survey of Ireland and the Ordnance Survey, Thomas Colby is really important, instrumental actually, in coming up with a new design for measurement. He created these so-called Colby's bars, which are metal bars used in survey, and measured nearly 8 miles using these bars. And we can see that in these two contemporary images here. On the top is from the measurement of the Calcutta baseline, which Everest undertook in the 1830s. And on the bottom there, the Irish equivalent, which came slightly earlier. So when Everest was visiting Colby, this is what he was seeing. When Everest was in Ireland, when he was seeing what Colby was doing on the north coast there, on the Lochfoyle base, he was looking at these operations, the use of those Colby's bars, you can see laid out on the trestles, with all the paraphernalia associated with that, the very fine measurement of this particular linear distance of 8 miles. Relating that within the context of India, in around Calcutta, as you can see there, from Prinsip's drawing from 1831, the same sort of apparatus. The imagery is so close. But what's noticeable as well, just bear in mind, is that the image at the bottom there, although it purports to show the Lochfoyle baseline in 1826, 27, 28, the drawing itself comes from 1847, which is post-dates actually the Calcutta and the Prinsip's drawing, as you see at the top there. But there are, again, these seeming parallels, connections between instruments. And actually Everest, George Everest took Colby's bars to India, and that's what we're seeing in that measurement process. And the same with the great theodolite, as it was called, the great instrument used in India. There's an example there on the left-hand side from Dehradun, so now part of the collection of the Survey of India. Very similar in its design, in its construction, in its use to the theodolites being used in Ireland under Thomas Colby. So we have a movement of these instruments and these bodies constructing imperial spaces. Looking behind the map, this is what was going on in the field. Right, time is pressing, isn't it? So I'm going to say a few words now about the second element of my kind of thinking about these fields of empire, which is to look at monuments, to look at the landscape itself, to look at particular places. This is a so-called base tower. This is a tower on the Lochfoyle baseline. Again, looking across there to the Inishowen Peninsula at Benebna. So we're just standing here in the north of Ireland, looking across Lochfoyle. And you see the tower there in the distance. They're called towers, these things. An important part of the measurement of this Lochfoyle baseline. There is an earlier version of those towers, and this was devised by Colby, as you can see here, who was elected as a fellow of the Royal Society in 1820. Everest himself was elected, I think, in 1827, slightly later than Colby, which again is interesting, you know, thinking about the connections with the between these men through the Royal Society, what they might have learned from each other. But the design for this tower, this was designed to mark the terminal point of this very carefully measured baseline, which was part of the Survey of Ireland. But this design itself was not carried through. Instead, we have this design, but interestingly, it's still called a tower, even though the thing itself is not actually very high. But nevertheless, it was designed, and here's the important point, for permanence. This was a feature in the landscape which indicated to those all around it that the Ordnance Survey were here. They were in the field, and this was a legacy, something created with a sense of permanence. And was described at the time, you know, in quite a lot of detail, actually, in terms of its construction methods, a chamber of masonry. These are very solid constructions, a tumulus of earth. I like the way in which the language there points to some sort of sense of, you know, these things being monuments. They're monumentalizing the map making process in the landscape, making clear to those all around that the surveyors had been there and left their mark quite literally on the landscape for all to see. And the same sort of thing we begin to see in India as well under Great Trigonometrical Survey. There's the theodolite, I mentioned a moment ago. In the context of India, the towers themselves, which were constructed, as you'll see next, were quite substantial towers attributed to Everest himself. And again, it is interesting to me anyway, to think about the connections between Colby and Everest. You know, what were they talking about in the 1820s? You know, when Everest was faced with those challenges, as you can see here from the description of in some cases quite significant low-lying parts of the Indian landscape, and how to get the great instrument, the theodolite, high up, so that you could get the intervisibility from one trigonometrical station to another trigonometrical station. The importance of these towers, as they were called, you know, that's the process that Everest undertook there, and the comparisons of what we were just seeing around the Lochville baseline, I think, are instructive. You know, what were they talking about? What were they thinking about in the 1820s and 1830s? In the context of the Calcutta baseline, you might have seen it in that Princeps drawing, the tower in the background there with the two figures on the top of the tower in the distance. So these are, you'll see in a minute, these are still upstanding in Calcutta, these great tall towers, 75 feet high, much larger than the ones we just saw in and around Benevna. The focus of our study for the Surveying Empires project was around Calcutta. And again, I just put this up here to give some sense of the scale of what Everest was facing and the challenge, actually. And the construction of these towers, these are some of the field work that I was doing with colleagues in West Bengal. Large towers, as you've just seen, but not without their problems, as the quotation indicates there. And criticisms made actually at the time by the Great Trigonometrical Survey of India of the quality of workmanship for these towers. Sometimes they fell down, as in the case of the one on the right-hand side. What these towers do, I think, looking at the monumentality of mapping, is gets to think about the impact of the map-making process on the landscape and those in that landscape. So they've got a couple of quotations here from Mapping an Empire to think a little bit about. So in terms of the first one there, what Hedney's talking about here, very Foucauldian is kind of outlook. The disciplining of the landscape, he says, took place within the scope of the map. Well, I would suggest as well the disciplining of the landscape and those within it took place within the scope of the field, because it was through the field that mapping was most sort of palpable to those in the landscape. And the second quotation there about subversion between negotiation and contestation between the British and the Indians, I think, again, perhaps makes us, we just need to pause a little bit on that. Is it such a binary between colonizer and colonized? How did it feel to be watched over? These towers are actually called watchtowers by local people. When we went out into the field and found out what they thought about, what local people thought about them, they were often described locally as watchtowers. You know, that kind of sense of surveillance was very palpable to those in that locality. Right, I'm going to end pretty soon now, because I know it's pretty much time for me to end. I'm with a third point. So this is kind of bringing, I've been looking historically, I suppose, looking at mobilities and looking at the monuments around different elements of materiality there. The third point here is to look at the landscape as it is today, to think about the legacies of the surveying practices of 200 years ago in Ireland as well as in India. So on the one hand, you know, this heritage, as we might call it today, the legacies, the material culture of the past of these survey practices is under threat, whether it's through coastal erosion, as you can see there from the aerial image, or just neglect, as in the case of the survey tower from Somalia near Calcutta on the right-hand side there. In visiting these places through our work in India, we got a sense of what these places mean and meant to local people, and also the way in which these monuments in some cases are aestheticized, as in the case of one of the towers at either end of the Calcutta baseline, constructed under Everest there in the 1830s in Calcutta, on the left-hand side, is memorialized by the local municipality within Calcutta. So it's painted. The middle tower there, which is the Bola Tower in just outside Calcutta, has a lot, you can see a lot of the vegetation is creeping over it. But there's a caveat to that, because when one of the occasions when I visited it with my colleagues, there was a little group outside from local people outside at the bottom of the tower actually cooking the legumes. You can see on the tower itself, there are various sort of gourds, I think you call them. And they invited us to eat those gourds with them. So, you know, there's an appropriation, therefore, of this surveying heritage amongst local communities in this part of West Bengal. And we see that on the right-hand side as well, in another one of the towers in Calcutta itself, a little shrine being set up. So what this requires, I think, is not just us looking at maps, looking at landscapes, but talking, understanding, you know, engaging with communities. And that really is partly what we were doing in India, but it's also really important in what we're doing in Ireland as well, through the Mapping Monuments project, retracing the steps of the Ordnance Survey, but engaging with local communities. This is us out on Benevna a few weeks ago, literally following in the footsteps of the surveyors with local volunteers from the local community. So actually engaging through the map making process is as important now, I would suggest, obviously, as it was back then in the 1820s, 1830s. So briefly, some conclusions. The field is, I would suggest, underexplored. It is ripe for further empirical and conceptual research as well, whether it's done archaeologically or historically or anthropologically or sociologically or linguistically. Is a really, I think, important move here to go from the colonial archive to those spaces and places of survey. So I hope in a very few minutes there that has been of some use to us, to you in our discussions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen there then and see if I can regain the, where are we? Sorry, here we go. Stop share. Okay, so that's a whistle stop tour. Thanks very much. I'm happy to take any questions or comments if anybody has any.
Oh, do we have questions, comments, either virtually or in person? Well, while we were thinking, I had a thought when I was listening to Keith, and it is this. In dialectology as was, which is our field of basically trying to draw isoglosses, lines on the map which designate one dialect area as distinct from another dialect area. That was the MO all the time. But increasingly, a lot more thought and work and energy has gone into what people on the ground actually believe those dialect boundaries to be. So in fact, there's a relatively new field of dialectology, which is actually called perceptual dialectology, which is really about people's attitudes and perceptions to those lines that the map makers, the original linguists, who decided that, well, this vowel is up here and it's not down there. It's actually a much more nuanced picture, which is very much like the kind of picture that I think you were trying to paint, but in a slightly different discipline. Am I right?
That's interesting, yeah, because so it's in a sense, again, it's a return to the field. You know, to engage, thinking of it both historically, so going back into the field, for me anyway, back to the 1830s, to look at the practice of the surveyors themselves and their cultural encounters, how those maps were constructed, but as well as that, thinking about it from a contemporary perspective about what these things mean to people today. So that's interesting. Actually, there is a kind of parallel there between these two sort of fields. You know, we're coming at, and so this is kind of a nice opportunity to kind of bring those two things together. So they're not running in parallel lines. There's some convergence as well.
Anybody else got any thoughts? Kingsley.
Kingsley, from University of Nigeria. Now, when you were talking about, especially at the beginning, you talked about how place names are mnemonic devices, if I remember your term very clearly. And it got me thinking about the place names in Nigeria and how these are highly colonial in outlook For instance, not just names of places, most of the place names were were given by the colonialists, not just the specific name, but even how they are spelled. For instance, I speak Igbo, which is one of the Nigerian languages, and a very popular city in Nigeria is spelled Oka, is called Oka, which is in Igbo, it should be just O-K-A, but it's spelled A-W-K-A. Right, and you find such discrepancies, and now that we're talking about decolonizing, and that has to do with what you talked about, I was thinking if how such things in terms of place names, in terms of spelling, which does not sync with the language of the people, how we can think of the colonialism in that, and also thinking about how difficult it is sometimes to change these names that have been embedded in maps as well, how what to do about such things.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, I think with the thing about some of these maps, particularly those which Friel is interested in, the Ordnance Survey of Ireland in the 1820s, 1830s, in the sense that they are fossilizing a particular way of spelling a place name or a particular place name on a map. It's being fossilized by the map itself. So there are, whereas we know there are all these sort of multiplicities of spellings, variations of spelling and so on and so forth, as well as language. So one of the things we can perhaps begin to do is to use new modes of mapping, which are much more agile, much more fluid, much more flexible, rather the paper map doesn't really lend itself to this very easily, in the sense that, you know, what's on the map is printed and it's just there, the name, unless you have a very complicated map. But with technologies like digital mapping, for example, you can have lots of layers and you can overlay maps and names and so on. And, you know, I think it's much richer form of cartography. So that whether that then begins to open up a map to different kinds of voices. So rather than dominant voices always being, you know, represented on the map with the name, actually instead you get these alternative spellings, alternative names, and so on and so forth for particular localities. And that might be one way of doing this through, I mean, the actual technology is called geographic information systems. But I mean, there's some really good websites at the moment for cities I know of in England, like Bristol. There's one called Know Your Place. And it invites communities to add content. So it's a bit like crowdsourcing. I call it citizen cartography, where people can actually add content and enrich it. Actually, it's a much richer thing. And so from what for the example from Nigeria there, it sounds something like that sort of platform would begin to open up the map instead of it kind of being something which sort of closes things down. So that the scope is there certainly for that.
And I suppose that ties in really nicely as well with what we're doing in the workshop with Karen earlier, that in a way, these texts, without digital humanities and without those kinds of technologies, it's very difficult to see the relationships between people, as we were talking about, or letters written by one person to another. Sorry, I can see a hand there behind me.
Well, I come from the University of the Balearic Islands. My name is Antania. And I wanted to comment on, now that we're talking about maps, my brother is also a linguist, and he was offered to work at the, collaborate with the What Three Words project. I don't know if you have heard of it.
Sounds good though.
Yeah, it's a project that intends to make a world map, a global map, but instead of coordinates, you could find a place based on 3 words. That is, for example, this room would have some, or would be maybe 1 coordinate, and you could find it typing book, person.
Oh yes, I do know what you mean. Yeah, yeah.
And I would like to know what you think of this project, and to what extent, or how can they organize it in such a way that they include more than 1 language? Because I was thinking there are places that have more than 1 language at the same place, so what words do they choose there? And how does it impact in the colonization?
Really good question.
Yeah, about coordinates, I suppose. I mean, the way I've seen this before is it's often used as a, you know, if you're out in the wilderness or something like that, it's a way of very easily, where instead of having like 12 numbers with the latitude and longitude, you've got 3 words. But you're right, you know, in the sense that, you know, those words are English words. At least the ones I've always seen have only been in English. So, you know, there is a kind of set of power relations there again, isn't there, really? As there always is in cartography, in map making. It's always, I mean, Brian Harley, if you're interested in this sort of thing, I would suggest strongly that you look at some of the work of Brian Harley on deconstructing the map, which he wrote in 1990 or 89 or something like that, a long time ago. He died shortly afterwards, unfortunately. But, you know, that kind of thing about whose voices do we hear, you know, when we're looking at maps, you know, where are the silences, where are the absences, and these sorts of things about power relations, of politics in maps, as well as a use of maps in politics, and begin to unravel some of that. And it sounds to me like, you know, there's similar discussions going on in language and linguistics as there is also in the history of cartography and historical geography. So I think that's, you know, I'm really sorry I'm not with you actually, because it'd be great over a cup of coffee or a beer or something to have that kind of discussion. But it's a very important point actually, to think very carefully about language and maps.
So you tell that to your brother. He needs more languages in his maps. Any other? Tony.
Keith, it's Tony Crowley from University of Leeds. I've been working in South Armagh for a long time, really. And part of it is just an observation. So often I'll come up, I don't mean in places like Crossmaglen or Keady, but I mean, if you're in a village somewhere, when I say a village, you know, 5 houses and a pub, and you say to someone, is this, whatever it might be called, Silverbridge or Whitecross or whatever, you just met with a blank, you know, people will just say, never heard of it, right? Literally never heard of it. At which point I will pull out the map and say, well, it says here, right? That's his name place. And people will literally say, I've never heard of it. You know, maybe you could try, you know, try in the pub and see if anyone, but there's a sort of gap there. Well, actually, I mean, it sort of reinforces the point that you're making about British cities. When I grew up in working class Liverpool, I never heard of the proper official cartographic name for many places until I don't know, I mean, really until I was a late teenager, probably, because I knew the Mars. I mean, none of the pubs were called by their names. Right? No pub was ever called its name. It was called by something else. They're all known as something else. You know, Galton Village was called the Turn in the Road. I never heard it called Galton Village, and it was never called that. And so on and so on. So there's a sort of unofficial or popular form of knowledge in a way that's just not tapped. You know, and there's something deeply political about that, because then when you look at the map, you know, I was born in Lancashire in 1960 because I was born in Liverpool. Except in 1972, Liverpool wasn't in Lancashire. It was in Merseyside, which is, you know what I mean? So within, like, the map changed, and and my identity in some sense has changed because, well, at least for official purposes, it changed. So I'm trying to point that, you know, there's an enormous gap sometimes between what you might call popular knowledge, and then whatever is rendered officially. And there's just, you know, there's an important politics of that, I think. And, you know, I'm very interested in the GIS mapping. If they're doing that with Bristol, that's great. But that's a project that I've been thinking about in Liverpool, because still people, you know, like there are certain places in Liverpool where if I said that to if I said, do you know where such and such is, he would have no idea at all. Whereas if you said, do you know, and then you used another name like the Kazi or whatever it might be, he would know it immediately. So, but there's a sort of politics to it, because it's sort of, it's a failure of recognition in a way.
I think that, yeah, thanks. I think again, that highlights the importance of our opening up of different kinds of ways of researching maps and the field and landscapes and localities, and not just relying on the archive and what appears on maps, but actually to engage with communities. And that in both of these projects, which I described, Surveying Empires and also Mapping Monuments, it was a really important part of what we did, which was, you know, to engage with local communities, talk to local people, which in West Bengal was possible because I had collaborators who were able linguistically to be able to do that because I couldn't. But so, you know, there was always going to be sort of potential barriers there in all sorts of ways. But anyway, yeah, you're right. Absolutely. It's about, if we're interested in this, to recognize the richness of it as a subject, I think means, you know, getting out of the classroom. And I know you're off to the you're going off now to a little, was it you're going the Tynemouth?
Yeah, we're off to the Tyneside Irish Centre.
That's right, yeah. So you can have a chat to the folks down there about the Ordnance Survey and see what kind of response you get. Be interesting.
Listen, Keith, we are going to have to move because the food down there is hot, so we don't want to be too late. But thank you so much. And I really look forward to longer conversations with you over a coffee, not over a beer in my case, because I don't actually drink, but over a coffee where we can talk further about ways in which politics, language and geography really can talk to one another in this really interesting space.
Fantastic.
Thank you so much, Keith.
Thanks.
Take care.
Have a good evening.